to be here. Thank you so much. I want to talk to you today about our collective story. I want to start with remembering that each of us has a story. Every person has a story. And we talk about that, and we talk about how important it is to realize that we are both the writer and the star of our story. We make decisions about where we go in our lives. And we either make conscious decisions or unconscious decisions. And when we make conscious decisions that come from the consciousness of who we truly are, that is love, and that is wisdom, and that is purity, and grace, and forgiveness, and compassion, life turns out a certain way. And if we are unconscious, that means that we do not make decisions from that place. We are not reflective. We are not wise. We are ruled more by fear than by love, by the energies of the lower self than the energies of the truth of who we are. And when we behave that way, there are still consequences to our behavior, but consequences of fear-based behavior provide an entirely different experience for ourselves and those around us. Well, that is true, not just for our individual experience, but for our collective experience as well. And what I want to talk to you about today is that field out of which we make our collective experiences and out of which we make our collective decisions. That's really what politics is. Politics from the Latin root means not of the government, it is of the people. And Gandhi said that politics should be sacred. Now, obviously, he didn't mean religious doctrine, religious dogma. When he said politics should be sacred, he was using the word the way we would use it. Wise, deep, reflective, loving, mature, sober, meaningful. And in everything in life, both our individual decisions or our collective decisions, we have two choices. You can play it deep or you can play it shallow. But you learn through enough life experience that there is a price to be paid for not behaving reflectively. There is a price to be paid for not behaving wisely. Because no matter what we do, the law of cause and effect means there will be consequences to whatever it is that we do. Now, even though Gandhi said politics should be sacred, that this collective field of decision-making should be a collective field of sobriety and wisdom and maturity, obviously what we have in the world today, certainly in our country, more often than not, is a politics that is not a container for our deepest thinking, but rather a container for our most shallow selves. And out of that shallowness, which is unconsciousness, emerges unconscious behavior. And at a certain point, if our collective decision-making is unconscious, it is incumbent upon us to do what we can to make it conscious. Now, just as we as individuals have story, and we seek to understand our story, not just by understanding what we have been through in our own lives, but we seek to understand what our parents went through and what our grandparents went through. We understand what our ancestors went through, because that way we can see who we are, where we sort of stand in the ribbon of history. And you see what your parents got right, and you go, that's really something. I want to live up to that. I want to stand on the shoulders of those who got it so good, and I want to bequeath to my children the strengths that my parents gave to me. But we also sometimes see things that our parents did and ways that our parents were, and instead we say, that one stops right here. I will not give to my children that neurosis that my parents passed on to me. But we do that as a nation as well. It behooves us to know, where did we come from? What's the entire ribbon of history? Because just as an individual writes the story, I write the story. Each and every one of us, we are responsible for the story of your life that is today. We are responsible for what we think, and we are responsible for what we do. And every generation in the history of a country is the steward of the story of our time. And so regardless of what the story was in America, for instance, until today, we decide what the chapter is today in our time. And then our children and their children will decide the story for their time. But just as in our own individual lives, if I can bring to my children the strengths of my parents, my children will be better off. And if I absolutely commit to cutting the cord and interrupting the pattern and dropping the chain by which I inherit the negatives of my parents, then my children will be blessed thereby. And now it is time in our time to look at the history of the United States and to look at the present of the United States and to understand the story of the United States and to look at the good and say, we're going to expand that. We're going to build on that. We're going to make it even better, and we're going to pass that on to our children. But we're also going to take a good look at where America has not gotten it right and where America isn't getting it right, and we're going to say that stops right here, so our children shall be blessed. So let's look at the story, because it is a magnificent one. And the story of America began before America began, because America began in reaction to something that went before. And that something that went before was a society that had lasted for ages. And that society was based on a particular philosophical worldview. And out of that worldview emerged the politics by which it would be expressed in external terms. That worldview was, and I remember learning this as a little girl, the idea of the divine right of kings. That God had given power to this one person. Maybe two, maybe there was a king and a queen. And then they had their friends, their cronies, and they were called the aristocracy. And because it was the belief, the philosophical belief that God had given the power to the monarch to share with just those friends, then the entire social order and political system that arose from that was such that it was deemed that the king and the queen and the aristocracy were entitled to whatever they wanted. They had the power. And so they could have all the resources of the country. They could have the land, they could have the money, they could have the crops. And what did that mean for everybody else? The vast majority of the population. Well, the vast majority of the population was over here, struggling to survive, because after the aristocrats and the monarchy had feasted on the wealth of the nation, then whatever crumbs fell off the table after they had finished, everybody else was diminished to the state of an economic serf. And they would just have to struggle to survive, to compete for whatever crumbs they could get in order to survive and feed their children. Now, our country was founded on a complete repudiation of that worldview. You want to talk about a paradigm shift? You name a paradigm shift that could possibly be more radical and more fundamental than going from God gave power to the king to God gave power to everyone. That God created everyone equal. That completely shoves aside an entire social order, because it says, you're a king, you're a queen. We're not even going to have a king or queen, because no one will be above us. And even the president will be equal before the law. And there will be no aristocracy, because we're all equal. A radical idea. It was a radical idea then, and it is a radical idea now. And so those ideas, the ideas that stem, it all begins in ideas, not just for an individual. It begins in ideas for countries, for groups of people. And so the idea was that all people were created equal by God. And therefore the politics, the political system that would emerge from that would have all people equal before the law. All people with equal rights, equal opportunities, equal access to education. Equality so that every man, woman, and child could thrive, except that they didn't actually totally mean everyone. And so these men, who were geniuses, who had reached the point in their lives, and you know, we shouldn't be glib about this, because these men did risk their lives, and by signing the Declaration of Independence, you were risking your life. Because if this had not gone well, your behavior was an act of treason against the King of England. If this had not gone well, you would be drawn and quartered. That's what you could expect, which is perhaps certainly among the most heinous ways to die. Okay. Now, the Course in Miracles says enlightenment begins as an abstract concept. You get it up here. So, and then the Course in Miracles says enlightenment begins as an abstract concept and then makes a journey without distance from here to here. So these were men, some of whom got the concept and were able and willing to stand courageously on the concept, encoded them into our founding documents, and yet some of them themselves owned slaves. So that was the beginning of our story. This dichotomy between the fact that on the one hand, the most enlightened principles you could possibly imagine are encoded into the founding documents, into the Constitution of a country, and those are the principles on which we purport to stand, and the fact that from the very beginning of our country, there have been wide gaps at times between who and what we purported to be, the principles on which we stand, and how we actually behaved. And often this is true in our own individual lives, hopefully to not such a great extent. Now, the story of America begins there, but that's when the narrative becomes very, very interesting. Because as we know, the crucifixion is never the end of the story. The resurrection is the end of the story. Slavery of the Israelites in Egypt was not the end of the story. Deliverance to the promised land was the end of the story. Remember, it's not over till the happy part. And if the happy part's not here yet, it ain't over. So it began with slavery, yes. But that's not the end of the story. You know, sometimes people say, well, I'm descended from slaves. Remember, you're also descended from people who resisted slavery. Our ancestors were not just the victims, our ancestors were the victors. And so we want to remember that even though there was the institution, the most evil you can imagine, of slavery, there was then the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement arose from the Quakers, the spiritual practice of which was to sit in silence and to hear the inner guidance and to see the inner light within every man, woman, and child. And out of that moral space and field of truth emerged an unwillingness to remain quiet about that which transgressed against that light. Therefore emerged the abolitionist movement. And that movement, combined with the Civil War, led to the abolition of slavery. That was the resurrection. That was the deliverance. That was the happy part. And then women had no right to vote in the United States. We were just institutionally deemed second-class citizens. You couldn't own property. You couldn't have your children. If you wanted to divorce your husband, you could, but you couldn't take any money with you. You couldn't take your children with you. You could just take whatever was in a little suitcase that you could carry by yourself and the clothes on your back. And it goes on and on and on. But that was the beginning of the story. It was not the end of the story, because a generation rose up. And the suffragette movement, and then that paved the way for the passage of the 19th Amendment that abolished that institution and gave women the right to vote. And so that was the happy part. Then well into the 20th century, there was institutionalized racism in the United States, oppression of black people in the American South, Jim Crow laws, legalized segregation. But then there arose. You always want to remember the then there arose. Then there arose a preacher named Martin Luther King from Atlanta, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the emergence of the Civil Rights Movement, paving the way for the passage of civil rights legislation that ended legalized segregation in the United States. So first there's the dark, and then there arises. And what arises are people no longer willing to go along in any way, shape, or form. And in the face of obstruction, and in the face of resistance, and in the face of whatever technological or institutional or scientific or governmental or economic resistance to what they knew in their hearts was feasible, they invoked what is feasible through the grace of God, and so it was. Now that is the narrative of our country. Yes, we've gotten it wrong. Just like as individuals, there have been times when we've gotten it wrong. But the spunk of the American people and the courage of the American people and that lineage of the American people of which we should all be proud is that we do tend over time to get it right. Now, I believe that we're living once more. I don't know whatever makes us think we're different from other generations, or that somehow it all started with us, or that somehow it all ended before we got here. In life, you're constantly improving, and in life, you're constantly given the choice. You're going to progress or you're going to regress, because life doesn't work where there's a guarantee that tomorrow will be better than today. I write tomorrow today. And so just as in our own individual lives, you can't say, every year of my life, things have gotten better. No, some years of my life, I was really on it. And other years of my life, oh my God, to even remember. And so it is with a country. Success is not guaranteed. Democracy is not guaranteed. Freedom is not guaranteed. Liberty is not guaranteed. It is not guaranteed. It is rather in the hands of every generation to decide. And ours no less. And so I believe, and perhaps some of you do as well, that we are living at a time, as much as at any other time in our history, where there are those, just as in every generation, there have been those who looked at those extraordinary principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and the equality of opportunity and democracy itself and the idea that all men are created equal and that the governance of the country is placed in the hands of the people rather than a small group. There have been those in every generation before us who had been lit on fire. Their hearts have been on fire with that idea. You know, in the Jewish religion, it says every generation must rediscover God for itself. And every generation of Americans must rediscover for itself why this democracy thing and how much does it matter to us. And if you are a person whose parent dies and that parent had a lot of money and a lot of material resources and that parent left those material resources and left that money to you, you would realize you had been given a great gift and you should act very wisely and you should act with great respect towards that gift that had been given to you and tend to it and expand on it so that you can bequeath even more to your children. I think we sometimes tend to forget that democracy itself is this great gift that has been bequeathed to us, sometimes by those who struggled in order to protect it, who struggled in order to foster it, and struggled and sometimes died in order to bequeath it to us. And yet we take this gift for granted sometimes, don't we? And so it's time for us to remember that this thing is not guaranteed. And to remember that just as there have been those in generations before us who took it very seriously, and not just their right to it, but their responsibility towards it, we must do the same. Or we will experience collectively the same thing that we experience individually when we do not behave consciously. I mean, who among us in this room can't look at times where we lost something precious? We weren't looking. We weren't thinking. We took it for granted. We just thought it would always be there. We didn't tend to it. And then the time came and it was gone. Well, that can happen to a nation. A nation just like it can happen to an individual. So just as there have always been those whose hearts were lit on fire by what it meant to say that God created everyone equal and that there should be equality of rights and opportunities. There have always been in every generation, and there are in our generation, those of us who feel this is so serious. This is so real. We must show up for this. But there are also those in our generation, just as there have been those in every generation, who didn't really honor that idea. Didn't necessarily think it was a good idea at all. Maybe didn't even see what we're even talking about. All they knew was that a certain other kind of way was how they liked it. You know, where just a few people have most of the power. You know, enough with this of the people, by the people, for the people thing. How about this of a few of the people, by a few of the people, and for a few of the people thing? You see, ladies and gentlemen, nations, just like individuals, don't necessarily progress. Sometimes we regress, and we in the United States are regressing today. We are regressing, whether you call it an oligarchy or a corporatocracy or a plutocracy, I don't care what you call it. Those of us who are metaphysically oriented know the words don't matter, the patterns matter. And the pattern is an aristocratic situation, and the story of America is that we repudiated an aristocracy. Maybe we need to repudiate it again. Now, who were those who were able to stand in the field of darkness and invoke the light? Who is it throughout our history, whether it was in the face of slavery or in the face of institutionalized suppression of women or in the face of institutionalized racism in the 20th century? What were the characteristics of those communities? They were spiritual communities. They were spiritual communities that did not separate themselves from the larger narrative of where America was going. Rather, they were the great foundation of every single social justice movement in the United States. That's what the Quakers were. That's what the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was. And I believe that in our time, we are faced with a situation as challenging to our democracy, as challenging to that philosophical notion of the equality of all souls, and a social order and a political system that would emerge from that, in which it is deemed that all people, not just white people, not just men, not just straight people, not just rich people, not just any group of people hold the power because of the spiritual notion that that which is truly who we are all equal, and as we know, the reason we're all equal is because we are all one. Now, the United States of America hasn't always gotten it right, but when we have gotten it right, and we got it right by positing and establishing a nation based on that idea, we have been a light unto the nations. But when you are the most powerful country in the world, when you get it right, you're a blessing, but when you get it wrong, it's wrong for a lot of people. You know, somebody once said to me when I felt that I'd made a mistake, I said, everybody's being so harsh, everybody's being so punishing, everybody's so judgmental of me. And this friend said, because people expect more of you. And I think that's part of what's going on with a lot of people's attitudes towards America today. A lot of people are just about the United States, and I think it's because on some level they expect more from us. And they don't know what we're thinking. They're looking at us thinking, what you're asleep. Like, what's with you? Don't you understand what you're losing? I think sometimes people in other countries are more aware of that than we are. But let me tell you something. Even though other people in other countries roll their eyes about us sometimes, in my experience, those same people are the first to acknowledge, yeah, but when America's awake, we slam it like nobody's business. And that's why after Pearl Harbor, a Japanese admiral famously said, I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes it's a characterological thing about Americans. You know, sometimes we go to sleep because there's just so much to do. There's so much to distract us. There's so much going on. We have so many reasons, some so convenient to be disengaged and so forth. But we are a good people, we are a decent people, we are a compassionate people, and we are a loving people as much as anyone on this earth. And when we do see unnecessary suffering, we don't like it. When we do see injustice, we don't like it. When we do see that which is unfair and that which is not free, we don't like it. Now, we have a very insidious system today in which it's kind of part of the game to keep enough suffering on the other side of town or on the other side of the world that we don't necessarily see it. But what's going on today is we're all waking up and we're starting to see it and we don't like it. And that's what's happening in the United States today. A giant is waking up. And as at any other time in our history, just like every 40 to 50 years, people in the United States, it's like clockwork. Every 40 to 50 years, a generation wakes up and goes, what the hell's going on here? And course correct. And course correct. That's what you do in life. But in order to transform one life, you have to be willing to take a brutally honest look at yourself. They say in AA, an individual is as sick as their secrets, so is a country. An individual has to be willing to look, where am I who I say I am, and where am I not who I say I am? What are the principles on which I live, and where am I not living them? And in the place where I'm not living them, where do I need to change? And then your crisis transforms into opportunity. Then your life does change. Until then, you're just playing at change. And this is not a time in the United States of America where we can afford to just play at change. No, this is a time in our history where those of us, I believe, who understand how transformational principles work, we should be the last people sitting out the responsibilities of the great collective story. Because if you know what changes one life, you're the one with a clue as to what changes the world. And for those of us who are even tempted to say, oh, but politics is so unconscious, well, those of us who are conscious haven't been talking consciousness within it. We have been withholding our contribution, and it's time to look. We're not here to ignore the darkness. We're here to transform the darkness in ourselves and in the world. We're not here to live in denial. We're here to live in transcendence, and there's a difference. Denial is where I don't even look at the darkness. Transcendence is where I see you, and I see right through you, because I know that in the presence of who I really am, you dissolve into the nothingness from whence you came. And that's true if it's my own character defect, or if it's all of us together staring down the national character defects that have allowed us to just get off track. We're not the first generation of Americans or as a country that's gone off track. But if we're not careful, we will be the first generation of Americans to not address the challenge of putting it back on. We're not a wimpy people. Do you think abolitionists were wimpy people? Do you think the civil rights movement was filled with wimpy people? Do you think the women's suffragettes were wimpy people? Hardly. They were people of great moral courage and fortitude who stood vertically on what they knew to be true. And when they saw that which they knew was morally unacceptable, they refused to in any way, shape, go along, to the point where they were unwilling to be quiet about it. They were unwilling to be passive in front of it. They were unwilling to be quiet. They were needing within their own hearts to be the people of courage and the people of passion and the people of intention and the people of activism. Having been activated by the spirit of the possible, they were then activated on the world with an activism that came from an activism within their spirits. And in the presence of that, I don't care how long an institution had been in place, how many hundreds of years, how much money was behind it, how much governmental power was behind it, how much technology behind it. Those things dissolved in the presence of a field of people who remembered who they were. In the Course in Miracles, it says, only what you are not giving can be lacking in any situation. And so when we look at all the problems in the world, the problems of the world are simply a sign of the absence of the answer. And the answer is us, standing forth as who we truly are. We're not the water, but we're the faucet. We're not the light, but we are the lamps. And it doesn't matter the size of the lamp or the shape of the lamp or the design of the lamp. What matters is that that lamp get plugged in. Because this house is wired for electricity. And it doesn't matter. The water is there. The water is the eternal water of God's wisdom and God's infinite power. But you got to turn the faucet on. Every time we say, I'm willing, use me. Where would you have me go? What would you have me do? What would you have me say and to whom? In all the ways that we sing today, in all the ways we sing every time here on Sunday at Agape, that we make ourselves available, that we say, oh God, I forgot for a while. I thought it was all about me. Oops, my bad. Now I remember. It's about us. It's not about being girls in a woman's body. It's about being women in a woman's body. It's not about being boys in a man's body. It's about being men in a man's body. So that people no longer roll their eyes about Americans. When we're reminded who Americans are, people in the world will be reminded who Americans are. We are not just people who make endless war. We are people who have it within us to make endless peace. We are not the inheritors of a legacy of oppression and suppression and injustice. We are the inheritors of a legacy of all that is just and all that is good and all that is free. And if we are living at a time where that's not happening in certain ways, then we just simply better make it right. And that's what those before us have done. Those before us have at times been victims, but those before us have at other times been victors. And that the only true victory is God's victory. In the Course in Miracles says, God does not give you victory in battle. He lifts you above the battlefield. That's where the spirit is. It's not about doing battle with the darkness. It's simply about being so much light that in the presence of that light, the darkness disappears. But you don't get there by ignoring the darkness. You stand in front of the darkness in all of your light. In other words, once you know God's boss, you show darkness who's boss. And once darkness sees who you are, that you are boss. Why? Because in America, we are all boss. That's the point here. That's the point here. In our individual lives, we know this. In our individual lives, you don't pull the wool over our eyes. In our individual lives, we don't like being manipulated. In our individual lives, we don't like being controlled. In our individual lives, we don't like somebody crossing over those boundaries. In our individual lives, we are willing to say so. So why in our collective lives are we just sitting here like wimpy Stepford citizens? Why? Oh, baby, no. Once we remember who we are, not just as individuals, making a stand for what I want, but as a collective, making a stand for what we want. Not out of selfishness, but out of the fact that we are stewards of a great and infinitely priceless treasure, bequeathed to us by generations who fought and died, by geniuses who bequeathed the principles. And it is our responsibility to bequeath it to future generations as it has been bequeathed to us. That's deep. That's meaningful. And we are worthy of the task. because the same presence of God that was in them is in us. The same power in Jesus, the same power in Moses, the same power in Gandhi, the same power in King, the same power in Susan B. Anthony, the same power in all the greats who have ever lived is in us. The issue is that they allow that power to be actualized, that which sometimes is only potential in us. The power of the spiritual journey is to activate that which lies within us all, to actualize the potential which lies within us all. And when we do, when we so are on fire with the power of God in us, we don't just have a better career or a better relationship. Oh, baby, we change the world, we transform the world. And ultimately, there will be a world in which there is no war, there is only peace. There will be a war in which there are no hungry children. There will be a world in which there is no unnecessary suffering. And whether that happens, all of it in our lifetime or not, we can have the sweet, sweet taste of the last moments of life knowing that it's getting there because I did my part. It's time for our generation, ladies and gentlemen, to do our part. And when we create that field, when we are so activated that we are not just, oh God, I really hope that happens. But we are, no, I intend that that happen. I'm going to make sure it happens because I am a collaborator in this field of possibility, not just passively, not just hoping. We need more than the audacity of hope. We need the audacity to wield power, the power of all that is good and true and beautiful in us. This is a new time. This is our time. And then, having so shown up, really having that visceral experience, it's not just abstract, but we know we are surrounded by collaborators. And those collaborators are the angels among us. Not just the angels of thought, but the angels who are the men and the women at our left and our right, in front of us and behind us, all around each other, surrounding each other with every thought of you go, every thought of I'm there with you, every thought of I'm in support, every thought of I got your back. We're doing this together. We are doing this together. We are not just thinking this together. We are doing this together. We will demonstrate once more, as Americans and other generations have demonstrated before, when Americans get it right. It's a very beautiful, beautiful thing. And when we do, when we allow this particular ray, not that America's special, no person is special, and no country is special. But every person is unique and has its own gorgeous ray, and every country is unique and has its own gorgeous ray. And whatever country is this incarnation, whatever country we find ourselves in, that it shine most beautifully is our responsibility. It's the meaning of our lives, part of the meaning of our lives while we are here. So when it comes to our citizenship, just as when it comes to our own individual lives, we have two choices. We can play it deep or we can play it shallow. When we really play it deep, one of the things we do, just one, is we take it to Washington. Thank you very, 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 very much.